From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Jerry Firestein, Senior Vice President at MEI, hosting this week's episode. Today we're going to be talking about the Abraham Accords. 1 year ago, on August 13th, 2020, the White House announced that Israel and the United Arab Emirates had agreed to normalize their relations. Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco all followed over the coming months. David Friedman, at the time the U.S. ambassador to Israel, recently told the Jerusalem Post that, in his view, the normalization process is ahead of schedule in terms of its implementation. Is Friedman's perspective supported by the facts? How have relations between Israel and the four Arab states advanced over the past year, politically, economically, and socially? In light of the Biden administration's support for the Abraham Accords, what are the prospects for further expansion of the normalization push with additional Arab states? Are there prospects for major non-Arab states, similarly, to establish full relations with Israel? Today, to help answer these questions, we're joined by two outstanding observers. First, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Karen Young, Washington's leading analyst of Middle East economic issues. We're delighted that Karen has recently joined MEI as our senior fellow and director of our new economy and energy program. We invite you to look for Karen's commentary and analysis on the MEI website. We're equally delighted to welcome our old friend Dennis Ross. Dennis is currently at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he is the counselor as well as the head of several of their programs. For over a quarter of a century, Dennis has been a mainstay of initiatives to promote Israeli-Palestinian and more broadly Arab-Israeli peace. So Dennis, let me begin with you and just ask for your sense, picking up on David Friedman's comment, what is your sense of the implementation of the Abraham Accords over the past year? Have there been any surprises? Is it proceeding along the lines that you would have anticipated?
I think in general terms, I would say it is proceeding along the lines I anticipated, meaning I didn't assume it was going to be an automatic linear pathway where we would see kind of nonstop advances. What I felt was a threshold had been crossed, but it would take time to begin to institutionalize it and implement it. What we've seen, I think, between the UAE and Israel is clearly an effort to make this the stuff of peace. What I mean by that is to give it real content, to give it an economic content, to create more of a people-people reality. And that we've seen, I think, that develop in, again, a gradual way, an incremental way with the UAE. We're now seeing that there are going to be Emirati students that are going to go to Israeli universities. Obviously, there have been deals that have been struck between private sectors on each side. One of the more interesting deals that was struck was one that actually took place after the conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, between an Israeli company called Watergen and an Emirati company. Watergen creates a unit that draws out of the air's humidity, basically drinking water, up to 1,500 liters per unit. And they've struck a very interesting deal where 20 of these units will be provided to the UAE, and the UAE will also be marketing it throughout the rest of the Middle East into Africa. I cite this just as one example. There's obviously been a number of other examples. In the health area, the UAE is the one that's clearly most pronounced in terms of progress, but we've just had the Israeli foreign minister go to Morocco. He opened the mission. There's going to be the opening of an embassy. We now know Bahrain is moving as well. Sudan is the one that is moving sort of most slowly, which I think was to be anticipated. I would say on the whole, what we're seeing is there is progress being made. This is a new reality that is emerging. To create the real people-to-people reality will take some time. That I pretty much expected, but I think we're moving in the right direction.
Thanks, Dennis. If I can follow up, the three of the four states that have joined the Abraham Accords, Morocco, Bahrain, and the UAE, had, of course, long-standing de facto relations with Israel, not de jure. How has the fact that they are now full diplomatic de jure relations, how do you think that's changed the calculus of the three states?
I think, when you go from de facto to de jure, by definition, you're formalizing a relationship. I think the reality of the new character of these relations is one that in the eyes, I think, of all the parties, means that they operate now simply at a different level. I think the character of their communications are different. The foreign ministry to foreign ministry, government to government, that takes on a different kind of character than we've seen before. And I think that all of these countries feel that. Clearly, as I said, you now have a formal visit by the Israeli foreign minister to Morocco. You've just had a formal Bahraini delegation go to Israel. I think what you're seeing is that there's actually discussions on real policies between the governments. What you had before was an informal relationship, a kind of de facto relationship that was, I think, pretty much characterized more by what could be done in the security areas, what could be done in the intelligence areas. In many ways, it fell into these silos. Now what you're seeing is relationships that almost by definition are going to be broader in terms of the areas that can be engaged, not just the formal areas in terms of government to government, but even also developing a kind of legal basis for what can be done in terms of trade, commercial relations, and the like. So you're really simply at a different level because of the formalization of this relationship. And that, too, is something that we're seeing being built, what I would describe in a kind of brick-by-brick fashion.
Karen, let me follow up on that if I can. Dennis clearly is looking at the economy and trade-related issues as really being kind of a central component of the normalization and what the rationale was, especially perhaps for the Emirates, but maybe also for the other states. What's your view on how those economic and trade related issues have advanced over the past year?
Well, thank you, Jerry. Thank you for the warm welcome. And it's really an honor to be on the program with Ambassador Ross. I would say that in terms of the expectations, I mean, really from the UAE and the Bahraini point of view, this was about also an avenue for economic diversification, for increasing foreign direct investment flows, and for, getting access to new kinds of technologies that Israel is known for, as well as its culture of its startup nation culture, which the UAE finds, they admire a lot. But I would say the progress so far has been somewhat moderate and really state-led on the part of the UAE, and not so rich in terms of back and forth, people-to-people ties in terms of private enterprise. So, I mean, the data so far from September 2020 to June 2021, from Israel to the UAE, we've seen about $130 million of new foreign direct investment flows, a lot in cyber, consulting firm, a diamond exchange was very early, a medical center, and there's one private equity firm, which is it started a joint fund, $100 billion fund, basically a debt equity fund. So of the investments that we've seen from Israel to the UAE, they've been larger than what we've seen from the UAE to Israel, but basically about the same, about $80 million from the UAE to Israel in the interim period. But these were all from government-related entities, right? So the private flows from the UAE to Israel have not been very strong. There's one exception from the Habtoor Group. I think what's more important is that these accords are really less about that business ambition and really more about national strategic priorities, particularly for the UAE. And these are mostly in energy. And all have faced some significant regulatory hurdles or obstacles in, kind of sealing the deals. So the first is in this MedRed company formed between Petromal, which is a very closely related firm to the ruling family in Abu Dhabi, and the Europe Asia Pipeline Company, which is the company that was formed in the late 1960s to build the pipeline between Iran and Israel. And the idea is that for the Emirates, they could bypass the choke point of the Suez by getting oil products into the Mediterranean through the pipeline at Eilat. But this has faced some internal opposition in Israel on environmental concerns from the environmental minister. And some of the storage containers at Eilat were actually hit by rocket fire from Gaza in the latest surge of conflict in May of this year. Secondly, in ports, DP World has made a bid to operate the port in Haifa. That's still under consideration. There's been an MOU for a UAE company to invest in the gas business in the Tamar gas field. But this has also been quite slow, and it's not sure that that deal will move forward. So, in terms of oil pipelines, port operations, and getting into the East Med gas business, these are all strategic priorities for the UAE. But in each of those cases, there's been basically pushback, either regulatory pushback from inside of Israel or some, kind of cold feet in terms of sealing the investment deal.
One other area that, of course, has been much discussed is tourism. Do you see tourism, particularly again with the UAE, as being a major component of growing economic cooperation?
Well, Israelis are happy to travel, and we did see a surge in Israeli tourists going to Dubai when COVID restrictions were lifted over the New Year's period. And I hope that that will continue. I mean, obviously, in the kind of travel environment we're in right now, it's a little hard to predict where things will go. In terms on the other side of Emiratis and Bahrainis, in particular, being able to visit Israel, I think there's interest, but that met some dampening, certainly in May. And, the Palestinian issue is still very prominent for, most Gulf Arabs. And so this is a little bit more of a hard sell. I think in terms of investment opportunity in tourism, obviously there's a lot of advantages that entities in the Gulf could offer to the Israeli tourism market, especially in the hotel business. So there's a lot of potential there, but it's yet to be really acted upon.
Thanks, Karen. Dennis, to come back, and you and I were just in Saudi Arabia a couple of weeks ago. The issue of relations with Israel, the Abraham Accords, came up in our conversations. What's your sense of potential for expansion of the Abraham Accords beyond the four that have already agreed, either in the Arab world or potentially to look at Islamic states that are not Arab?
Jerry, I think there is a potential. I think in terms of the Saudis, it's clear there's a relationship below the radar screen that exists, and the question is, what would it take to raise it above it? I think one of the things that you and I both heard was a lot of frustration with the Palestinians on the Saudi side, a kind of interest in Israel, certainly not only in the security area, but also in the, you might call the digitalization of the economy area. But I also feel like what we heard was the Saudis are mindful that they have an Arab leadership reality and a Muslim world leadership reality, and they take those into account as they think about what they might do towards the Israelis, meaning from that standpoint, they would like to see something more happen between the Israelis and the Palestinians before they necessarily would take a leap. But I would basically add 2 points here. One is, it's pretty clear to me that from a Saudi perspective, anything that they would do towards Israel would involve not only what Israel might do towards the Palestinians, but also what the United States might do towards Saudi Arabia. Just as in the case of each of the other countries that decided to normalize with Israel, they had an agenda with the United States, not just a Palestinian agenda. In the case of the Saudis, obviously, I think there's a sense of what assurances, what commitments, what might be done in the U.S.-Saudi relationship were Saudi Arabia to do more public outreach towards Israel. So I think there's an equation here where they would look for steps that Israel might take towards the Palestinians, but also what would the U.S. do in response or for Saudi Arabia? In the case of the UAE, what we saw was not only getting a commitment not to annex the territories allotted to Israel under the Trump peace plan, but also to get weapon systems that had been denied the UAE under the rubric of the American commitment to preserving Israel's qualitative military edge. So F-35s, Predator drones, which had long been sought by the UAE, did become worse than commitments were made on those as part of doing the Abraham Accords. So in the case of the Saudis, again, you're likely to see something similar in terms of what might they get, even if they weren't doing full normalization. Let's say they decided to open a commercial trade office in Tel Aviv. What would the Israelis be prepared to do that would be the political equivalent of that? And my suggestion would be that Israel would stop building to the east of the security barrier or outside the settlement blocks, because that preserves the option of separation. That preserves the option of two states. Unlike the stopping annexation of territories allotted under the Trump plan, this might be the equivalent of stopping creeping annexation. So that might be something the Saudis would have an interest in, but it wouldn't be enough by itself. It obviously would have to be connected to what the U.S. was doing in the relationship or commitments it was making on security for the Saudis. As for other non-Arab states, I recall going back to Rabin's time, the interest in Indonesia, the country with the largest Muslim population. I would guess that would be another possible area of interest that one could see the Israelis would have, and we would see, again, what the U.S. could do. It does seem to me that in almost all these cases, it's not going to happen on its own. These countries are not going to take the initiative on their own, but there could be, again, a kind of an American brokering role, much as there was, I think, with these previous understandings. I think that would have to be the case here as well.
Karen, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, if I could just add, I think there really is sort of an open question of what are U.S. foreign policy priorities for the region, and how did they see these players all fitting together and helping to forward those priorities? So if in the Trump administration, the idea was that economic growth, investment flows, particularly from Israel in partnership with the Gulf states, could be a catalyst for the kind of changes they wanted to see region-wide. And this largely bypassed the Palestinian question wholeheartedly. And, in the Biden administration now, one of the central initiatives that the Trump administration had to achieve that goal was a $3 billion fund through the Development Finance Corporation, which was a trilateral fund meant to be, deploying U.S. capital with a return, not grants or aid, but, this was basically in a business kind of orientation, in order for Israel and the UAE to invest in other countries in the region, right? And that fund has been completely suspended by the Biden administration. And so that's not the direction they're headed in. And they've, certainly voiced more support for the two-state solution and wanting to see, a stop of Israeli encroachment onto Palestinian lands. So, this is what I think needs to be clarified. And if we want to see more cooperation and other parties join, and certainly to put money on the table from Saudi Arabia, for example, that U.S. priority needs to be more fully spelled out. And right now, it's not.
Could I just add to that? I think Karen put her finger on something. It is a question of how important is this in the larger scheme of things in terms of American foreign policy. How important is trying to build a coalition against Iran, given the current circumstances of the new Iranian government, the administration's desire to return to the JCPOA, and yet at the same time, if there is a return to the JCPOA, which is being increasingly questioned, it then becomes, there is the issue whether we're in the JCPOA or we're not. What are we doing to counter the Iranians in the region? How important is this coalition for that? I think that kind of a question, something that Karen is raising, I think is right, that if it's not a major priority or significant priority for the administration, they won't make the kind of investment in this. And what I was trying to get at is, if you really want to see this process move, it takes an American initiative. It won't happen on its own. So we would have to view this as being important enough, either because we think it's a way to break a stalemate between the Israelis and Palestinians. I want to say something about that in a second. Or we think it's a way to create more of a coalition to counter the Iranians. It has to be driven, I think, by an objective the administration has in the region that justifies it taking more of an initiative. And let me just quickly add the following point. The value of following the UAE model and applying it to others, where the UAE said, look, we'll normalize, but there can't be annexation. Even if the Palestinians felt that this was providing the Israelis something before you were ending occupation, what you were doing was creating a relationship between what the UAE did and what Israel could do vis-a-vis the Palestinians. In this case, it was the prevention of a negative move. Now, the question is whether or not you could create these kind of triangular approaches where if, for example, the Saudis take the kind of step I was describing, say, open a commercial office in Tel Aviv, and you broker, in other words, you go to the Saudis and say, would you be prepared to do this? And the Saudis say, here's what we would require from the Israelis to take a step like that. Here's what we would require from you to take a step like that. And then you go to the Israelis and then you try to produce that step. The virtue of that is, if in fact it produced something like an end to creeping annexation, that could be a device or an instrument to change or break the stalemate that presently exists between Israelis and Palestinians. So I do see this as an interesting possible mechanism to break that stalemate, but it would be something that is sufficiently important in the eyes of the Biden administration that it would justify them taking this kind of an initiative.
Well, let me ask you, Dennis, the initial impetus for the Abraham Accords was clearly coming from Benjamin Netanyahu, and this was seen very much as a Netanyahu foreign policy initiative. We're talking about steps that the government of Israel might take that would help improve the environment, if you will, for additional states to join the process. What's your sense of where the current Israeli government is? Are they as committed to these Abraham Accord initiatives as Netanyahu was? Are they willing to make the kinds of decisions, understanding where Naftali Bennett is and where many of the members of his coalition are on some of these issues that you're talking about?
Jerry, I think the short answer is, A, they have a real interest in trying to build on the Abraham Accords, in no small part simply to show that, in fact, this wasn't just a function of what Bibi Netanyahu did, that they can actually go beyond, they can actually achieve more than he did. So I think from a political standpoint, there actually is an interest in that. From the politics of this coalition, it may appear to be difficult, but again, bear in mind what this coalition embodies. It embodies two far right-wing parties, but it also embodies two left-wing parties. It also embodies an Arab party. It involves two centrist parties and one right-of-center party. So I think, again, if you take a look at what happened when, in the aftermath of the Abraham Accords, when Netanyahu agreed to what amounted to a 4-year period of no annexation, the body politic within Israel very much preferred normalization over annexation. There were polls that showed 80% of the Israeli public supported the decision to do this. Now, typically, you can't get 80% of the Israeli public to agree on whether it's day or night. So the fact that normalization scored so high in terms of Israeli public attitudes suggests to me that this government, if in fact they could produce a very significant addition to the normalization process, that they would be prepared to take the political move that would be required. Now, again, the kind of thing I'm seeing or I'm describing with the Saudis is not full normalization, but a political step of significant political outreach. I think that if that could provide the political tailwind for this government to take a step. But I don't think, as I said before, we're going to see either the Israelis or the Saudis or other Arab states or a country like Indonesia. The impetus for this, the initiative for this, is not necessarily going to come from them. Right now, you're seeing the Israeli foreign minister, Yair Lapid, just made a trip to Morocco. I think trip to Bahrain is probably going to be in the offing. He will do a lot, I think, to build on the existing accords. Obviously, he'll be interested in reaching beyond them, but his ability to do it, to offer initiatives, I think is limited given the nature of the coalition, but it wouldn't be limited if, in fact, we produce an initiative where the outreach is clear from the Arab side and there's also a clear price that's required of the Israelis.
Karen, I guess the last question for you, and it goes back, and if the Israelis and other Arab states see advantage and see angles where this can be a positive development in terms of Israeli-Palestinian, perhaps even internally in the Palestinian territories, do you see opportunities here for the Palestinians to take advantage of these initiatives in order to benefit economically from normalization?
Well, I agree with Ambassador Ross here. I mean, this really requires a U.S. hand to be an advocate for the Palestinians for that to make it possible. I think what it motivates, particularly the Emiratis, this is in their own national interest and their own strategic interest for economic development and for, thinking about the security of their export products and their future. That's what's motivating all of these, energy type deals that they're making and using normalization as a means to do so. I don't think we see the Palestinians as driving this trend or these movements. And it certainly would require an outside actor, the United States, to make that more central. I don't think there's any impetus or inclination to direct funds or development funds or investment funds into the Palestinian territories from these signatories otherwise.
Well, I'm afraid that that's all we have time for today. I want to thank Karen Young and Dennis Ross for joining us for this conversation. And a special thanks to you, our listeners. If you enjoyed this program, please be sure to subscribe and share it with your friends. You can send us comments on Twitter and Facebook. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.